Alright, folks, tonight we're kicking things off not with some stuffy philosopher or pompous king, but with something way more treacherous and convoluted. Medieval dating. Because believe it or not, finding romance during an era of plague outbreaks, dowry negotiations, and constant chaperones made modern awkward texting look like child's play. From flowery, courtly love ballads to marriages arranged like livestock trades, romance back then had less to do with butterflies and more with property deeds. Before you get too comfortable though, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely dig what I'm serving up here. Drop a comment about where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always get a kick out of seeing our global audience. Now dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient background noise, and let's settle in for tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing in some medieval village or drafty stone castle wondering how to shoot your shot. Maybe you think you'll strike up casual conversation, compliment someone's fancy hose, ask if they come here often? Nope, that's not how this works at all. If you're living in the Middle Ages, dating as we know it doesn't exist. No flirting, no texting, no long walks to see where things go. Instead, your parents, your feudal lord, or your local abbot have already decided who you'll marry, when, and how many cows it'll take to seal the deal. If you're nobility, you've probably been betrothed since before your voice cracked. You might meet your future spouse for the first time at the altar. And yes, it's exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. The whole arrangement revolves around land rights, titles, and political alliances, not compatibility or whether they can carry you in League of Legends. For peasants, things are slightly less formal, but only slightly. Your family still has major say, and love rarely factors into negotiations. Maybe your folks know a nice girl whose family owns a productive goat. Maybe they admire a boy who can thatch roofs without face planting. Boom. You're officially courting now. Lucky you. It's not that medieval folks didn't feel romance. They absolutely did. It just wasn't the priority. Survival, inheritance, and social stability took precedence. Falling in love before marriage. Risky business. Falling in love outside marriage. Scandalous. Either way, major frowns from society. Unless you're the tragic protagonist of some poem, in which case go nuts with your doomed love affair. And yet, you dream. Maybe you scribble some terrible poetry on scrap parchment. Maybe you steal glances at the market. Maybe, just maybe, you develop feelings for someone your family's livestock appraiser didn't pre-approve. But for now, you wait. You obey. You try not to develop feelings for the miller's apprentice. Because in this world, love might be the poet's muse, but marriage is the business of parents, priests, and politicians. So you think someone's cute? Maybe it's how they balance a basket of onions on their head. Maybe it's their confident rug-beating technique. Your medieval heart skips a beat. But pump the brakes, because in this reality, romance doesn't blossom without a financial spreadsheet. Before you even think about courtship, you'd better ask, what do I bring to the table? And if your answer is a winning personality, you might want to sit back down. If you're a young man, you'll need land, livestock, tools, or at least a roof that doesn't leak too badly. Love letters are cute, but nothing says husband material like owning 2 healthy oxen and shelter that can withstand a light drizzle. If your dad already promised the family's best go to your brother, might want to consider taking holy orders. If you're a young woman, your family needs to pony up a dowry, whether coin, linens, or a suspiciously generous flock of geese. Doesn't matter how charming you are. If your family can't pay up, you'll be perfecting your embroidery solo for the foreseeable future. Now let's say you actually like someone. Someone who makes your calloused heart flutter. You lock eyes at the well. There's a spark. It's romantic. It's poetic. It's completely irrelevant because unless your families are financially matched, you might as well be crushing on a cloud. For nobility, it gets worse. Your marriage is tied to land disputes, borders, and political favors. You're not a person, you're a walking peace treaty. Congrats. Even peasants aren't safe. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pig pen conveniently borders someone else's wheat field. You dream of passion. You settle for water rights. And yet you try. Maybe you offer a small gift, a carved spoon, some berries, your least cracked mug. Maybe they smile, Maybe they don't. But the cold truth remains. In medieval dating, economics does the flirting, and love is just a bonus you hope develops eventually. Let's say you're not some peasant worrying about pigs, or a noble tangled in treaties. Let's say you're a knight, shiny armor, massive warhorse, and questionable poetry skills. What's your love life look like? Welcome to the bizarre, emotionally exhausting world of courtly love. Now this isn't dating. This is performance art with extra steps. Courtly love was the noble class's favorite pastime. Part flirtation, part spiritual suffering, and entirely impractical. As the dashing knight, you'd pick some noble lady, usually already married, and vow to worship her from afar. Not physically afar, though. That would ruin everything. No, you're supposed to suffer beautifully from a polite distance. You might compose tortured verses about her laugh sounding like silver bells or her hair burning like the sunset, which in medieval terms just means she has hair and hasn't insulted your family. You'd wear her colors in tournaments. You'd sigh dramatically. You'd occasionally joust some poor schmuck just because he looked at her 2 seconds too long. The whole thing was basically emotional parkour with more velvet. The lady's role? She gets to pretend this is flattering while maintaining emotional distance that would make a glacier seem warm. She might respond with a letter or token, maybe a ribbon if you're lucky. But mostly she's required to be mysteriously unattainable, because that's the whole point. Maximum drama, minimal actual contact. At best, you might score a nod across the banquet hall, or have her fingertips brush your gauntlet during a feast. Anything more physical? Suddenly, it's not courtly love anymore. It's scandalous adultery. And nobody wants that, at least not officially. This entire arrangement worked because everyone pretended it was just an elaborate game. It was basically a medieval pressure valve, a way to express longing and devotion without actually disrupting the social order. Was it dramatic? Absolutely. Did it involve more bad poetry than practical romance? Constantly. But for knights stuck between battles and boredom, courtly love gave them something to write about and someone to write for. Just don't expect a happy ending, a kiss, or even consistent eye contact. So you've fallen hard for someone. Great. Now comes the tricky part. Expressing those feelings in a society where touching someone's hand without a chaperone present is basically declaring war. Enter tokens. Think of these as the medieval version of texting, equally awkward, confusing, and open to wild misinterpretation. Imagine you're a knight hopelessly in love with Lady Marjorie of whatever her last name is. You can't speak to her alone, and your terrible poetry keeps getting intercepted by her confessor. What's a love-struck warrior to do? You send her a glove, or maybe your embroidered sleeve, because nothing says, "I adore you," like mailing someone part of your wardrobe. If you're on the receiving end, congratulations, you now own a sweaty linen sleeve you never asked for and the romantic burden of pretending you understand what it means. Is he declaring love? Asking a favor? Suggesting you take up sewing? Your guess is as good as his. Women gave tokens too. Ribbons, locks of hair, small pendants. These were sentimental, sure, but also dangerously strategic. Give the wrong guy the wrong token, and suddenly you're unofficially promised to some dude with a lazy eye and drinking problem. Tokens were meant to be subtle status updates. A glove pinned to your chest here, a ribbon tied to your sword hilt there. Everyone in the know understood the code, but nobody said it out loud. The more cryptic, the better. It wasn't about clear communication so much as plausible deniability. Oh, this glove pinned to my chest. No, not from Lady Joan. It just appeared on my pillow, scented with lavender. Total mystery. Sure, buddy. For commoners, tokens were simpler. Maybe a wood carving or hand-stitched handkerchief made between milkings. Still romantic, just with more calluses involved. But even these humble gifts carried risks. Give one to the wrong person, and suddenly the village is buzzing with rumors. Receive when you don't want. Now you've got to figure out how to return someone's sock without starting a blood feud. But despite all the awkwardness, these tokens held real emotional weight. In a world that gave love very little room to breathe, they were tiny acts of rebellion, small, tangible proof that hearts still beat beneath all the social constraints. So you finally work up the courage to talk to your crush. Maybe offer a flower. Maybe quote some terrible poetry you definitely didn't steal from a traveling minstrel. You're ready for a private moment. Unfortunately, you're never actually alone. Welcome to medieval dating surveillance state, where romance comes with a full audience of your mother, parish priest, nosy cousins, and possibly the neighborhood stray cat. Privacy? Never heard of her. Let's say you're a marriage-age young woman. You're never just going for a walk. You're going for a walk with Margaret and her terrifyingly strict aunt, who's been side-eyeing your posture since birth. Even something as simple as fetching water means performing under the watchful gaze of half the village. Someone's always watching. Dating isn't dating here. It's low-key espionage with more embroidery. And if you're a guy trying to court someone, better hope you've got approval from her family, local priest, and the village gossip network. Show up with flowers and her father will conveniently be sharpening something ominous by the door. Her mother will be stirring a pot that stopped boiling 3 hours ago. The priest will suddenly remember he needs to take his sunset morning prayers right outside her window. The logic behind all this supervision was simple. Protect virtue, preserve family honor, and absolutely prevent any unsanctioned touching, especially before marriage, especially alone, especially ever. Chaperones existed to monitor even the most innocent interactions. Group outings? Supervised. Walks? Supervised. Sitting within 2 meters of each other on a bench? Only if someone's grandmother is knitting nearby and pretending not to listen. The church, of course, had opinions, lots of them. They regulated courtship like bouncers at a particularly strict nightclub. Priests gave sermons about proper conduct and wrote lengthy treatises on the dangers of flirtation. Yes, you read that right. Medieval clergy published actual anti-flirting manuals. Imagine some poor monk copying those out by candlelight while his brothers silently judge him from across the scriptorium. Even letter writing wasn't safe. Some monasteries would open love letters to screen for immoral content. That's right, divine censorship at its finest. So if you want to fall in love, get used to doing it quietly while your entire extended family and possibly God himself watches your every move. Now let's say despite all this, you're in love, or at least medieval in love, which mostly involves longing, confusion, and excessive pacing near windows. You've exchanged glances across a feast. Maybe they picked up your dropped handkerchief without immediately burning it. The tension is unbearable, but you still can't speak freely. So what do? You write a letter. The secret love letter, the most dangerous piece of parchment since that excommunication notice. This is your chance to confess your feelings using the most cryptic, overly poetic language imaginable. Because you can't just say, I like you. No, you've got to say something like, my soul is a stag pierced by the arrow of your grace, roaming the forests of yearning. Subtle. Naturally, this assumes you're literate, which, let's be honest, wasn't a given. You'd scratch your message onto vellum or rough parchment. If you're extra, you might dust it with flower petals or perfume. Pro tip, be careful with that. One noble accidentally used his love letter to wrap a herring and delivered it to the wrong girl. They're married now. It's fine. Now comes the delivery problem. You can't just hand it over. You need a courier, a loyal servant, bribable monk, or younger sibling with questionable common sense. Sometimes minstrels doubled as medieval mailmen, singing your poem in the town square while pretending it was anonymous. Very subtle. And the poetry itself? Risky business. The line between romantic and heretical was thinner than monastery soup during Lent. If your metaphors even hinted at anything physical, you might find yourself confessing to both lust and terrible literary skills. But despite the rules, people wrote anyway. Some letters survived. Some poems got copied and passed around like contraband. In a world of rigid roles and constant supervision, a folded scrap of words could feel revolutionary. So you write. You risk it. You press your trembling hand to parchment and say everything you can't say aloud. Just maybe don't sign it too clearly. You're aiming for romance, not a church tribunal. Finally, a break. A feast day, harvest festival, or maypole dance. In other words, one of those rare moments when your life isn't just work, prayer, and pretending you're not into the blacksmith's daughter. Today, you're allowed to flirt. Sort of, as long as no one sees. or everyone sees but pretends not to. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance blooms under the collective gaze of everyone you've ever met and three particularly observant chickens. Festivals were among the few socially approved times men and women could mingle, laugh, and gasp, make prolonged eye contact. There's music, ale, and that one guy wearing a flower crown with alarming confidence. You've never seen so many people not pretending to be miserable. If you're a peasant, you might impress your crush by winning the sack race, catching a greased pig, or juggling stale bread rolls. Nothing says, "I'm dateable," like falling off a hay bale with dignity. Dancing was your best shot at actual physical contact. The steps were rigid, but a well-timed spin or accidental hand graze could communicate more than any poem. The maypole dance. Basically a giant excuse for coordinated flirtation wrapped in ribbons and plausible deniability. Nobles had their own version. Less hay, more terrible poetry. You might compose verses on the spot comparing your lady's eyes to twin candles or whatever else glows. You'd offer trinkets, hopefully not ones your servant clearly made 5 minutes prior. Food helped too. Offering someone your meat pie or sharing a honey cake was medieval for Netflix and chill. If they accepted with a smile, progress. If they fed it to their dog, back to the drawing board. But remember, every move you make, someone's watching. A parent, priest, or bard with loose lips. One wrong step and your flirty smile becomes next week's sermon topic. Still, for a few glorious hours, you can pretend. Pretend you live in a world where love isn't a transaction, where laughter isn't suspicious, and where public dancing doesn't end in penance. Let's say you're not a knight, noble, or poet with a lute and excessive feelings. You're just a regular villager, up with the cows, asleep with the chickens, and spending most days ankle-deep in mud. You're not looking for a poetic soulmate. You're looking for someone who can milk a goat without emotional drama. Welcome to peasant courtship, where romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry means we could survive winter together. In this world, dating isn't about long conversations or stolen glances. It's about shared labor. You notice someone because they work hard, complain little, and have most of their teeth. That's the whole checklist. You're not being picky, you're being realistic. You don't need fireworks. You need someone who can gut a fish and maybe doesn't snore like a dying bear. So how do you show interest? With gifts, small, useful ones. A basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, a particularly good turnip. If you're feeling fancy, maybe a carved spoon or woven ribbon. Nothing says, "I'm serious about you," like a spoon you whittled by candlelight while your judgmental pig watched. Conversations happen during chores. You might chat walking to the mill, tend sheep together, or exchange pleasantries while shoveling something suspiciously aromatic. No one's reciting poetry here. Topics include the weather, crop yields, and whether old Thomas fell in the well again. Spoiler, he did. Yet in its own way, it's romantic. There's sweetness in the simplicity, a shared life built on cooperation, not idealism. You know each other's strengths, weaknesses, and exactly how fast they run when a goat escapes. Proposals come quickly. If both parties agree, and more importantly, if the families agree, marriage follows shortly after. You might move into a shared hut or build a new one with village help. You bring your best blanket, they bring a goat. Together you begin the strange miracle of domestic survival. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. You've found someone who can cook, clean, tolerate your family, and doesn't visibly recoil at your feet. True love, medieval style. You've done it. You found a partner who meets basic survival criteria. Now comes marriage, which in medieval terms isn't a romantic vow, but a legally binding contract negotiated with all the passion of a livestock auction. For peasants, it's still serious business. You gather witnesses, consult the local priest, and try not to butcher the Latin during the ceremony. But beneath the sweet-sounding blessings lies a transactional reality. Dowry negotiations, land rights, livestock distribution, and contingency plans for if someone dies during planting season. Romance. For nobility? Buckle up. Your marriage is a full-blown corporate merger. Your parents, their parents, the priest, the scribe, and that one cousin who studied law once. They're all at the negotiating table. The bride and groom? Mostly just standing there looking decorative and nodding when spoken to. You might not have even met your future spouse. Your family has done the math. Your estate needs her fields. Her dowry covers your debts. Your coats of arms look good together. Congratulations, you're not a person anymore. You're a walking peace treaty. Even peasants aren't exempt from the practicality. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pig pen conveniently borders their wheat field. You dream of passion. You get irrigation rights. And once married, it's permanent. Divorce doesn't exist unless you can prove someone wasn't baptized, was secretly related to you, or died and forgot to mention it. Annulments require mountains of paperwork, divine intervention, and probably a hefty bribe. But not all is bleak. Some couples grow to love each other. Shared chores, raising children, surviving winters, these things build affection. Or at least tolerance, which in medieval terms is basically the same thing. The church is involved at every step. Marriage is a holy sacrament, one of the 7 big ones. You're not just marrying for legal reasons. You're marrying because God needs witnesses, possibly 2. So you stand there, exchange vows, and smile as someone hands over a sack of onions and calls it a blessing. Let's say you've had enough. Enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a particularly valuable sack of flour. You're nobility, but you want to marry for love, not land, lineage, or your father's ambitions. Congratulations, you're about to cause the scandal of the century. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of lighting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes. Running off to marry for love wasn't just rebellion. It was political sabotage. Imagine your Lady Eleanor, promised to boring lord estate secure, but you've fallen for a penniless squire who smells like horses and adventure. You meet secretly in the stables, whisper sweet nothings, then vanish to a monastery where the abbot owes you favors. There you marry under questionable legality with only a nervous monk and 2 chickens as witnesses. Back home, chaos. Your father threatens to siege the squire's family garden. Your mother weeps into her embroidery. The church is appalled. The gossip? Delicious. If you're the groom in this scenario, don't get comfortable. Best case, you keep your bride in kneecaps. Worst case, excommunication followed by creative disembowelment. Still, some couples got away with it. If the marriage couldn't be undone without greater embarrassment, families sometimes sighed and moved on. What's done is done, and at least nobody died. Hopefully. In rare cases, these scandals became legends. Songs were written, poems composed, stories whispered at banquets for generations. 2 nobles who chose love over duty became practically mythological. Because while most noble marriages were transactions, these rebellions reminded everyone that love, though inconvenient, refused to go extinct. So if modern dating feels dramatic, remember, at least your love life doesn't involve secret weddings, furious barons, and a horse tied to a ladder outside your window. Marriage in the Middle Ages? That beautiful union of 2 souls and their respective financial portfolios. Because while love was nice, a good dowry. Now that was true romance. Let's talk dowries. Because in the Middle Ages, love was optional, but a good financial package was mandatory. If you're a bride, you're not just getting married. You're being launched into the world like a small, dowry-equipped economic vessel. Your family prepares your dowry. Coins, linens, livestock, maybe a cow or 2, depending on how much they like you. And if they're feeling generous, a set of pewter dishes. These offerings go straight to your future husband, who accepts you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental abacus. Now flip the script. In some regions, it's not the bride's family giving goods, it's the bride price. The groom pays her family for the honor of marrying her, effectively saying, "Here's 3 pigs and a cloak. Now give me your daughter." Medieval romance at its finest. The point? Someone is always paying someone. Marriage isn't just a union. It's a transaction with receipts. These exchanges weren't just about wealth. They were about status, expectations, and public statements. A large dowry signaled prestige. A stingy one? Maybe the family was offloading their daughter for suspicious reasons, like her habit of talking back or her suspiciously frequent visits to the miller's son. As the bride, you didn't usually keep your dowry. It became part of the household economy, managed by your husband, guarded by law, and hopefully not gambled away on dice within the first month. If the marriage ended through death, annulment, or your husband suddenly deciding to join a monastery after a midlife crisis, your dowry was theoretically returnable. But good luck retrieving it. You'd need legal backing, family support, and ideally someone who could read Latin. Meanwhile, the bride price, if paid, was like buying a rare goat. Expensive upfront, no refunds. It compensated the bride's family for losing her labor. After all, who's going to milk the sheep now? So while love occasionally slipped into the equation, money was always at the altar. Now, let's say you skipped marriage entirely. Maybe you were a second son with no inheritance, your dowry was suspiciously small, or you just really liked chanting. Either way, you've joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations. You've taken vows of poverty, chastity, and aggressive disinterest in romance. And yet, here you are in a stone cloister, surrounded by silence, candle smoke, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful eyes. Yes, even behind monastery walls, forbidden love found a way. To be clear, falling in love in a religious order was deeply discouraged. Like, you might get whipped, exiled, or lectured by someone with a Latin name discouraged. You'd sworn to give your heart entirely to God, which meant giving it to no one else. But hearts are messy, and sometimes prayers started sounding suspiciously like love poems. Maybe it began innocently, passing each other bread in the refectory, whispering during vespers, laughing a little too hard when someone dropped a hymnal. Before you knew it, you were sneaking extra cheese into Sister Beatrice's satchel and questioning everything. Some monks and nuns wrote passionate letters, disguised, of course, as theological musings. Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation sounds holy, unless you read between the lines. And many did. Scandals erupted, secret meetings in the herb garden, midnight confessions that weren't strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a nun with a suspiciously round belly. Punishment, usually harsh, exile, public penance, or reassignment to some remote abbey known for sheep and silence. Still, not all stories ended in disgrace. Some lovers escaped. A few even married after being defrocked. Most, though, returned to their cloisters red-faced and redevoted, swearing the whole thing was just an overzealous theological debate. Because in the end, monastic life was about discipline. But humans are humans, even in robes, even in silence. And sometimes, a quiet glance across the chapel was more thrilling than any tournament or courtly poem. You did it. You got married. There was a priest, a pig roast, and someone spilled mead on your mother's only nice cloak. But now it's been a few months, or years, and something feels off. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying boar. Maybe they forgot to mention their gambling problem. Or maybe you just realized that marrying for land and sheep doesn't guarantee romantic bliss. Either way, welcome to medieval marital disappointment. Now, don't go reaching for divorce papers, because they don't exist. At least, not in any form you'd recognize. Marriage was sacred, unbreakable, and enforced by public shame. You could try for an annulment, but you'd need an excellent reason. We don't get along didn't cut it. You'd have to prove. One of you was underage, already married, too closely related, which happened disturbingly often. Or best case scenario, you never consummated the marriage, which meant someone had to confirm that in writing, possibly under oath. Good luck. If you were nobility, it got messy, eh? Your marriage wasn't just personal, it was political. Trying to escape, it could start feuds, ignite scandals, or launch a minor war. Best to just quietly resent each other and attend separate feasts. So what did unhappy couples do? Mostly, they endured. You slept in different beds. You sighed dramatically at dinner. You poured your feelings into embroidery or that one really angry song. Passive aggression became your love language. Of course, affairs happened. Usually quietly, sometimes spectacularly. Nobles took secret lovers. Peasants had helpful neighbors. The church condemned it, but that didn't stop people. It just made them better at sneaking around barns and blaming things on God's mysterious will. For women, escaping a bad marriage was especially hard. Even if your husband was violent or vanished, society expected you to stay loyal, silent, and mildly pious while surviving on bread crusts and disapproval. Still, some people made it work. Marriages weren't always happy, but they became partnerships forged by hardship, habit, and the shared experience of hauling firewood in the rain. Maybe it was the plague, maybe a farming accident, maybe they tripped over a goose in the dark. However it happened, you're now widowed, and suddenly the medieval dating pool opens back up. Being a widow in the Middle Ages was oddly liberating. Not do whatever you want liberating, but certainly more freedom than you had before. For women especially, widowhood often brought a taste of independence, managing land, making decisions, even speaking in public without being immediately shushed. And if you were youngish and still had most of your teeth, you could remarry quickly, very quickly. Mourning periods existed, but so did survival instincts. A widow with land and no husband was basically a walking treasure chest. Suitors appeared with alarming speed, some sincere, others just very enthusiastic about your dairy cows. If you're a man and recently widowed, society practically pushes you back into marriage. Who else is going to cook, clean, and raise the 11 children you somehow accumulated? So you start looking, maybe at the baker's daughter, maybe that quiet widow who always brings suspiciously good mead to market. Romance in second marriages could be surprisingly sweet. This time around, you're older, wiser. You're not being forced into an alliance. You're choosing someone to survive with. Maybe even someone you like. Wild concept. Of course, there were rules. The church frowned on remarriage happening too quickly. Your spouse isn't even cold yet, was generally considered poor timing. Widows often had to negotiate with family over dowries and inheritance. Nothing says romantic second chance, like arguing with your brother-in-law over who keeps the butter churn. But still, second marriages were common, even expected. Life was short, winters were long, and no one wanted to spend them alone if they didn't have to. And yes, love was part of it. Maybe not the swooning, sonnet-writing kind, but the quiet kind, based on shared stories, mutual respect, and the understanding that both of you had already seen some things. So you light the fire, pour the soup, and try again. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. You've made it this far, survived the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and possibly a dramatic barn elopement. But before you fall for someone new, ask yourself the most medieval question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of stars, bones, and whether or not your grandmother saw a fox this morning. Let's begin with astrology. Yes, before you kissed anyone, you might want to consult the local monk astrologer. Are your signs compatible? Is Venus in retrograde? Was your beloved born under an unlucky moon? If so, better to marry someone less cursed. Love is hard enough without planetary sabotage. Then there were birthmarks, mysterious little symbols that might identify you as your soulmate's long-lost twin or their destined executioner. Superstitions were flexible like that, but the church had its own checklist. You couldn't marry your cousin, or your second cousin, or your fourth cousin twice removed, unless you had special permission, which the wealthy often bought because loopholes. So before things got serious, you'd probably need to draw a family tree and then quietly erase parts of it. Social status also mattered deeply. A noble could not fall in love with a peasant without it being declared either a miracle or a moral failing. Cross-class romance was rare, scandalous, and only acceptable if it later became a tragic folk song. And then there were the omens. If a raven flew overhead while you were thinking about someone, bad sign. If you dropped bread at dinner while glancing at your crush, forget it. That's a cursed union. Someone might bury a charm under your doorstep to protect you from improper suitors, or to sabotage your chances. Love in this world wasn't just personal. It was mystical. Everyone had an opinion. The stars, the saints, the weather, and that one woman in the woods who definitely wasn't a witch, except she probably was. But despite all the rules, signs, and whispered warnings, people still loved. Clumsily, bravely, often against advice. Because medieval or not, the heart remains wonderfully disobedient. You've probably heard of Alexander the Great, maybe even Julius Caesar, but have you ever heard of the woman who allegedly chopped off the head of Cyrus the Great and dunked it in blood? Her name was Tomyris, and she didn't rule from a gilded throne or within high-walled cities. No, her court was the open sky, her army was the wind, and her power came not from titles, but from pure, unshakable authority. She was queen of the Massagetæ, a confederation of nomadic tribes who roamed the steppes of Central Asia. Think horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts, and battlefield justice. Tomyris didn't inherit her power from some pampered courtier system. She rose through grit, leadership, and possibly a healthy dose of don't mess with me energy. Her people were tough, accustomed to harsh winters, long migrations, and enemies on every side. But even among such people, she stood out. She was a warrior, a lawgiver, a ruler in her own right. No husband overshadowed her. No brother guided her hand. Now, to be clear, much of what we know about Tomyris comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a man not exactly known for his strict fact-checking. But if even a fraction of his account is true, then Tomyris wasn't just a queen. She was a storm in human form. At the heart of her story is this: a foreign superpower was growing stronger by the day. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great, had already conquered Lydia and Babylon. Now his gaze turned east. The Massagetæ were next on his list. But Cyrus didn't fully understand what kind of woman he was dealing with. Before the first arrow flew, before the first spear shattered, before her son's death changed everything, Tomyris was already preparing for war. Not because she wanted conquest, but because she refused submission. She wasn't just defending territory. She was defending a way of life. And as Cyrus would soon learn, there are some queens you just don't invade. Cyrus the Great had a reputation. He wasn't just any king. He was a conqueror's conqueror, the kind of man who could stroll into ancient cities, topple empires, and still get remembered fondly by historians. So when he looked east toward the land of the Massagetæ, he didn't exactly expect resistance. After all, who could possibly say no to the man who had taken Babylon without breaking a sweat? Cyrus sent a polite offer first, because of course, every good imperialist starts with a smile. He proposed a political marriage between himself and Tomyris. Now, you might think that's romantic, but Tomyris saw right through it. She understood that this wasn't about love or even alliance. It was about control. If she married Cyrus, her kingdom would become just another province of the Persian Empire, and she, a trophy queen. She declined, firmly. Cyrus, unaccustomed to rejection, didn't take it well. If he couldn't charm her into submission, he would take her kingdom by force. He crossed the Araxes River, which separated his empire from the lands of the Massagetæ, and established a foothold. But Tomyris wasn't idle. She gathered her warriors, consulted her chiefs, and prepared for what she knew was coming: war. Then came the bait. Cyrus, under the guidance of his general Harpagus, laid a trap. He left a portion of his army behind with a lavish camp overflowing with wine and food, luxuries that nomads rarely indulged in. Tomyris' son, Spargopizes, led a detachment to investigate. They raided the camp, took the supplies, and fatally drank the wine. The Persians returned at just the right moment, when the Massagetæ were drunk, disoriented, and unprepared. Spargopizes and his men were overwhelmed. He was captured alive. When Tomyris heard the news, her world cracked. This wasn't just a military loss. It was personal. Her son, her heir, was now a prisoner in Persian hands. She sent a message to Cyrus: "Give me back my son and leave. If you do not, I swear by the sun, the master of the Massagetæ, I will give you your fill of blood." Cyrus didn't listen. Spargopizes, ashamed of his capture, killed himself in Persian custody. Tomyris had just lost her only son, and now she was out for blood. Grief is a powerful thing, but grief mixed with fury? That's the recipe for absolute devastation. When Tomyris learned her son Spargopizes had taken his own life in Persian captivity, something inside her snapped. This was no longer about borders, pride, or even independence. This was war soaked in vengeance. And Tomyris wasn't one to grieve quietly. She didn't retire to her tent in mourning robes or weep by the fire. No, she mounted her horse, sharpened her weapons, and swore an oath that would echo through history. She would face Cyrus in battle. She would defeat him, and then she would make sure he never forgot her name, even in death. According to Herodotus, Tomyris summoned her tribal council. Under her command, the Massagetes mobilized. Picture it, hundreds of warriors on horseback, adorned in leather armor, wielding bows and spears, faces painted with fury. They didn't march like a Persian army. They moved like a storm, swift, chaotic, and with deadly precision. This time, she set the trap. Cyrus, perhaps overconfident from his earlier deception, underestimated her resolve. But Tomyris knew his tactics now. She studied his movements, waited for the right moment, and then unleashed everything. The two armies clashed in what Herodotus describes as one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world. There were no fancy formations or long speeches, just screaming horses, clashing blades, and a queen who fought alongside her warriors. No silk-robed empress here. Tomyris was in the thick of it, riding hard, cutting down enemies with merciless focus. And when the dust finally settled, Cyrus the Great was dead. Tomyris, ever theatrical in her justice, had his body searched. His head was severed, placed into a wineskin filled with blood, and presented as a final offering. According to Herodotus, she spoke to it, "You've thirsted for blood. Now drink your fill." Whether or not every detail is true is almost beside the point, because what matters is that Tomyris won. She crushed the most powerful empire of her day, avenged her son, and made sure that her name would be remembered not as a victim, but as a conqueror. And this was just the start of her legend. The battlefield was silent. The Persians were dead or fleeing, their legendary king lifeless in the dust. And Tomyris? She didn't celebrate like a conqueror. She didn't parade through Persepolis or carve her face into coins. Instead, she stood over Cyrus's body, her vengeance fulfilled, but her heart still broken. Victory, it turned out, didn't bring peace. The Massagetes had won more than just a battle. They had turned the tide of empire. The death of Cyrus the Great sent shockwaves across the ancient world. In Babylon, Egypt, and the far corners of the Persian realm, rumors swirled. The unstoppable king had fallen, not at the hands of another great empire, but by a nomadic queen who had no throne, no palace, just fury, grit, and a cavalry of warriors who would ride into hell for her. And yet, Tomyris didn't exploit her victory for conquest. She returned to her people with the same pragmatism she ruled with. No war taxes, no imperial ambitions. She didn't try to seize the Persian throne. That wasn't her world. Her justice had been served. Her son had been avenged. The empire could continue without Cyrus. But now it would think twice before ever riding east again. It's worth noting just how rare this was. Most rulers, after winning a battle of that magnitude, would have grabbed power with both hands. But Tomyris seemed more concerned with preserving her people's freedom than expanding her reach. And yet, this is where her story begins to fade. There are no records of her after the battle. No statues, no royal tomb, no Massagetes monuments carved in stone. She rides into the fog of history as elusive and untamed as the steppes themselves. Historians debate whether Herodotus exaggerated her tale. Some say Cyrus died elsewhere, that the wineskin of blood was poetic fiction. But even skeptics agree someone dealt Persia a heavy blow. And it wasn't a king. It wasn't a general. It was a queen, a mother, a woman whose love for her son fueled one of the most dramatic reckonings in ancient history. And her story? It didn't need to be written in stone. It was carried by the wind. Because when the wind howls across the steppe, some still say it whispers her name. Let's talk about the aftermath. Because killing a king isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a legend. Tomyris had done the impossible. She had defeated the most powerful ruler of her time, avenged her son, and sent the Persian Empire reeling. But what happens next? Where does a queen go after she's already won her greatest battle? The answer, it seems, is back to the steppes. Unlike conquerors who build monuments to themselves, Tomyris didn't linger in the wreckage of war. She didn't march on Persepolis or demand tribute from Persia's vassals. She didn't even bother carving her name into a rock somewhere. No, she simply returned to her people, the nomads, the warriors, the families who had followed her into battle. This is what makes her different. Most victors in history can't resist the pull of power. They expand, they conquer, they declare themselves gods. But Tomyris? She had already proven what she needed to prove. She wasn't interested in ruling an empire. She just wanted her people to be free. So she rode back into the grasslands, where the wind carried no titles, no decrees, just the sound of hooves on earth. But legends don't just disappear. Even if Tomyris didn't leave behind grand palaces or golden statues, her story lived on, passed down in whispers around campfires, retold by poets, and eventually written into history by men like Herodotus. And what a story it was. A queen who refused to bow, a mother who turned grief into vengeance, a warrior who fought not for land, but for justice. Centuries later, her name still echoes. Writers, artists, even kings have invoked her as a symbol of resistance. Catherine the Great of Russia admired her. Painters immortalized her holding Cyrus's head. Modern historians debate whether she was real or myth, but that's the thing about legends. They don't need to be factual to be powerful. Because Tomyris represents something timeless. The idea that no empire is invincible, that even the smallest people can defy the greatest rulers, and that sometimes the most dangerous force in the world isn't an army. It's a woman who refuses to surrender. So where did she go? Maybe she ruled for years in peace. Maybe she died in another battle. Maybe she simply vanished into the steppes, becoming one with the wind that still carries her name. But one thing is certain, Cyrus the Great met his match, and history never forgot her. To understand Tomyris, you must first understand the world that shaped her. The Massagetes weren't just another ancient civilization. They were nomads of the Eurasian steppe, a people who lived by the rhythm of hoofbeats and the turning seasons. Their wealth wasn't counted in gold coins or marble temples, but in horses, grazing lands, and the freedom to move where the wind took them. These were people who wore their armor like second skins, who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy from galloping horses, whose entire existence was a declaration of independence against the empires that sought to tame them. For the Massagetes, mobility wasn't just convenient. It was their greatest weapon. Why build walls when you could simply ride away? Why kneel to kings when the open sky was your cathedral? Tomyris embodied this spirit perfectly. She didn't rule from a stuffy throne room. Her court was wherever she pitched her tent. Her laws weren't carved in stone, but carried in the memories of her people. When Cyrus sent his marriage proposal, she didn't see an opportunity for alliance. She saw what it really was, an empire's attempt to swallow her people whole. The steppe shaped her tactics too. Where Persian armies moved like ponderous machines, weighed down by supply trains and rigid hierarchies, Tomyris forces struck like lightning. They didn't fight for territory, they fought to remain untamed. When she finally faced Cyrus in battle, it wasn't just armies clashing. It was two irreconcilable ways of life colliding. And when she won, she did something no Persian king would have dreamed of. She walked away. No occupying forces, no demands for tribute, just the satisfaction of knowing her people could keep living as they always had, free, mobile, and answering to no one but the sky above them. In that moment, Tomyris proved something revolutionary. That power didn't have to mean permanent conquest. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply the right to remain yourself. So where does this leave us? Between the constrained love of medieval Europe and the unbridled defiance of Tomyris, we're staring at civilization's oldest dilemma, the tension between walls and wind, between the safety of chains and the danger of freedom. The medieval world built institutions, churches that regulated love, kingdoms that mapped borders, contracts that turned marriage into arithmetic. Meanwhile, the steppes bred warriors who laughed at walls, women who led armies, and cultures where loyalty outranked law. Tomyris didn't just defeat Cyrus. She exposed the fragile arrogance of empires. Her greatest insult wasn't dipping his head in blood, it was walking away from his precious throne. History, of course, is written by those who build monuments. The medieval scribes who recorded courtly love tales were the same ones who erased women like Tomyris from proper history. They labeled nomads as barbarians, strong women as anomalies, and called their own constraints civilization. But the wind remembers what stone tablets forget. Centuries after Tomyris, the Mongols would prove her point spectacularly, that mobility could humble empires. Yet even Genghis Khan eventually got seduced by throne rooms. Not Tomyris. She remained the steppes' perfect daughter, victorious but unconquered, remembered but untamed. There's a reason her story outlasted Cyrus's palaces. It speaks to something primal in us, the part that still bridles at chaperones, that rolls eyes at dowry negotiations, that cheers when someone flips the script. Every time we choose authenticity over approval, we channel a bit of her spirit. The medieval world feared people like Tomyris because they proved alternatives existed. You didn't have to play the game. You could take the dowry goats and burn the contracts. You could value a person over their pedigree. You could, God forbid, marry for love. So let's end with two images. In a stone castle, a noblewoman stitches her 10th tapestry, dreaming of the troubadour she'll never touch. On the open steppe, a queen wipes blood from her sword, answering to no one but the wind. Between them stretches the unbridgeable gap between what the world is and what it could be. The tapestry will fade. The wind never stops.